Technology during World War I reflected a trend towards industrialism and the application of mass production methods to weapons and to the technology of warfare in general. This trend began 50 years prior to World War I during the U.S. Civil War and continued through many smaller conflicts in which new weapons were tested. World War I weaponry consisted of various types of weapons standardized and improved over the preceding period, together with some newly developed types using innovative technology and a number of improvised weapons. Military technology led to important innovations in weaponry, grenades, poison gas, and artillery, along with the submarine, warplane, and the tank. Much of the combat involved trench warfare, in which hundreds died for each yard gained. Trench warfare was a form of field fortification consisting of parallel rows of trenches. The front line directly faced the enemy. The space in between the two armies was known as the no man's land. The front line was protected by barbed wire, machine guns, mortars, and artillery. Behind the front line were the reserve trenches, also known as support trenches. These were the second line of defense, and they were used if the front line was captured by the enemy. There was also a third line of defense. These were known as the communication trenches. These were used to send fresh troops, water, food, mail, ammunition, and orders up to the front line. Also, these were used to carry wounded soldiers away from the battlefield. Trenches were formed in zigzags as opposed to straight lines. This was to prevent attackers from shooting straight down the trench, and it helped to reduce the effects of artillery shells. It also meant that it was more difficult for the trench to be captured, as the enemy had to fight around each corner to capture the entire trench. There are three methods of attacking a trench. The first method is to bombard the enemy's trenches with artillery. The artillery destroyed the enemy's communication trenches as well as the front line. This was done to prevent reinforcements from reaching the front line. The attackers then went over the top of their trenches and approached the opposition across the no man's land in the hope that when they reached the opposition's trenches, all those enemy soldiers would be dead, the barbed wire would be destroyed, and they could successfully capture the trench. This method was rarely successful because the Germans had dug their trenches so deep that they were protected from artillery. Also, the bombardment often warned the enemy of the oncoming charge, which allowed reinforcements to be hurried to the front lines. Another method was called the creeping barrage. This was a very well-developed tactic, which comprised of the British firing guns and shells, and then the soldiers charged behind the shells. The shell fire caused the Germans to be too scared to leave their trenches, allowing the British to capture part of the trench. However, there was one drawback to this tactic. If the cannon fire was not on target, then the charge was pointless. The third tactic involves soldiers digging a tunnel under the no man's land in an effort to reach the enemy without being seen and therefore catching them off guard. If the soldiers made it past enemy lines, they would then place explosives underneath them and detonate them. The hope in this is that the explosives would collapse the trenches above ground. This method was not effective, however, as listening devices were developed to detect enemy digging. Trench warfare had very little mobility, and due to this lack of mobility, battles often ended in stalemates. As the stalemate on the Western Front continued, the drive to find a weapon that could break this lack of mobility became more intense. Though they first terrified the Germans, the use of tanks in 1917 engagements provided more opportunities for development than actual battle successes. It was also realized that new tactics had to be developed to make the best use of this weapon. Commanders learned that tanks needed infantry support and mass formations to be effective. Early tanks were unreliable though, often breaking down. Reliability was the Achilles heels of tanks throughout the war. In the Battle of Amiens, a major Entente counteroffensive near the end of the war, British forces went to field with 534 tanks. After several days, only a few were still able to fight. Despite unreliability, tanks were able to break through enemy lines. Tanks were able to overcome barbed wire and cross trenches, causing panic and mayhem for the enemy. Regardless of their effects on World War I, tank technology had been launched and grew increasingly sophisticated in the years following the war. By World War II, the tanks had evolved to be a fearsome weapon, which made the trench warfare obsolete. Naval technology in World War I was dominated by the battleship. The launching of HMS Dreadnought revolutionized battleship construction. The HMS Dreadnought had a speed of 21 knots, which is equivalent to 24 miles per hour. It had 10 12-inch guns, whereas the biggest of the German ships only had 4. Battleships were built along the Dreadnought model with several large turrets of equally sized big guns. British ships had larger guns and were equipped and manned for quicker fire than their German counterparts. In contrast, the German ships had better optical equipment and were much more able to deal with damage. The Germans also generally had better propellant handling procedures. Many of the individual parts of the ships had recently improved dramatically. The introduction of the turbine led to much higher performance as well as taking up less room and thereby allowing for improved layout. The pre-Dreadnought battleships were generally limited to about 12 to 17 knots, which is about 14 to 20 miles per hour. Modern ships were capable of at least 20 knots, which is 23 miles per hour, and British ships were capable of 24 knots, which is 28 miles per hour. The introduction of the gyroscope and centralized fire control led to dramatic improvements in gunnery. Ships built before 1900 had effective ranges of about 2,000 yards, while modern ships were able to fire of over 10,000 yards. World War I was the first conflict in which submarines were a serious weapon of war. The submarine could approach underwater, safe from the guns of both the capital ships and the destroyers, and fire a torpedo at enemy ships. Limited range and speed, especially underwater, made these weapons difficult to use tactically. Submarines were generally more effective in attacking poorly defended merchant ships than in fighting surface warships, though several small and medium British warships were lost to the torpedoes launched from German submarines. Chemical weapons in World War I were primarily used to demoralize, injure, and kill entrenched defenders, against whom the indiscriminate and slow-moving gas clouds would be most effective against. The types of weapons employed range from disabling chemicals such as tear gas and mustard gas to lethal agents like chlorine. The killing capacity of gas, however, was limited. Only 4% of combat deaths were caused by gas. Because it was possible to develop effective countermeasures against chemical attacks, such as gas masks, gas was unlike most other weapons of the period. In the later stages of the war, as the use of gas increased, its overall effectiveness diminished. The widespread use of these agents of chemical warfare and wartime advances in the composition of high explosives gave rise to an occasionally expressed view of World War I as the chemist's war. As a stalemate developed on the ground, with both sides unable to advance even a few miles without a major battle and thousands of casualties, planes became greatly valued for their role in gathering intelligence on enemy positions and bombing the enemy supplies behind the trench lines. Both sides also made use of aircraft for sea reconnaissance, anti-submarine warfare, and the dropping of propaganda flyers. As with most other technologies, the aircraft underwent many improvements during World War I. Early planes were initially used as scouts. While early air spotters were unarmed, they soon began firing at each other with small arms carried in the cockpit. An arms race soon commenced, quickly leading to increasingly agile planes equipped with machine guns. A key innovation was the interrupter gear. This enabled the machine gun to be mounted behind a propeller. When the machine gun was fired, the interrupter prevented any bullets from striking the propeller blades. Germany made extensive use of Zeppelins. The Zeppelin was essentially a blimp. It consisted of a rigid, lightweight skeleton covered by canvas, several multi-plane stabilizing fins, internal combustion engines, and one or two observation baskets. The German airships were operated by both the Army and the Navy as two entirely separate divisions. Over the course of World War I, the Zeppelins were mainly used in reconnaissance missions for the Navy. Bombing missions, especially those of targeting London, captured the public's imagination, but in the end, proved to have only psychological value and were not a military success. While the plane did not play the decisive role that it was to play in later conflicts, the First World War proved their capabilities. It was during this period that the key tasks that the aircraft could perform were discovered, experimented with, and refined. Observation and reconnaissance, tactical and strategic bombing, ground attack, and naval warfare. With the growing importance and influence of aircraft came the need to control the air, and thus the fighter was born. Although the war ended on June 28, 1919, its ramifications were far-reaching. Technologically, great strides had been made in just about every area that might come into play during the war. But the cost had been dear, and the end only temporary. Deaths from the Great War have been estimated at 10 million, and the end of the war itself, the Treaty of Versailles, and its humiliating terms for Germany, laid the groundwork for World War II. The war was called the War to End All Wars, and at the time that seemed possible. Unfortunately, it would only prove untrue in less than a generation.